Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. So today we are going to continue talking about the factors that could influence poor IHC staining and what we can do to correct it. So we had already mentioned some points on my previous video, so we're going to continue mentioning another point. So the point I want to look at today has to do with the inadequate secondary antibody. Inadequate secondary antibody. In fact, depending on how you look at this, you could also see it as maybe poor secondary antibody selection, okay, like I'd already mentioned on the primary antibody selection. Okay, anyway, before we continue, my name is Dr. Emmanuel Obodo. I'm a biomedical scientist and I'm also a lecturer in biomedical science here in the United Kingdom. Now, what I want you to see is that maybe I should say something a little bit important that could give you a strong background. So when we look at immunological testing, like I'd already mentioned, so we need primary antibody. What the primary antibody will do is go, because note the word primary antibody, that means that antibody is specific to that particular antigen you are looking for. Okay, now what that primary antibody should do is to be able to bind it, but then you also need a secondary antibody. That secondary antibody will help to enhance the reaction. It will help to kind of enhance the binding. Does that make sense? Okay, so now what happens is that the antibody, the primary antibody, for example, if the primary antibody is a, let's say, any particular antibody raised in a particular laboratory animal, what is important is this: when you are selecting the secondary antibody, it's important that you also select a secondary antibody that is raised from the same laboratory animal that was used to raise the primary antibody. If, for example, a primary antibody was raised using mouse, and you can get a secondary antibody that that was raised using maybe rabbit, that is not going to work. Does that make sense? So that is one of the factors that could affect it. So now I'm talking about, when we talk about the secondary antibody, remember we had already incubated the sample tissue with the primary antibody. Perhaps there is a reaction, but we need the secondary antibody to be able to enhance the reaction. And if we are going to do that, it's important that we select or make use of a particular antibody that is raised using the same animal that was used to raise the primary antibody. Okay, so like I've said, let's say the primary antibody was raised using rabbit. It's important that the secondary antibody should also be raised using rabbit. Does that make sense? So if there's any differences between the primary and secondary antibody as per the laboratory animal which they were raised from, that would affect the IHC staining. I hope that makes sense. Okay, now having laid this foundation, so inadequate secondary antibody, what it means is that, remember, it's also important that while we are using this very antibody, that we make use of the required concentration that is enough to be able to enhance that very reaction. So if we don't use the required concentration of the secondary antibody, even though it might be a correct secondary antibody, it may have negative impact on the level of the IHC staining. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. All right, so what you are looking at, make sure you use the correct concentration, and also you make sure that the antibody you are that the secondary antibody is also raised from the same laboratory animal in which the primary antibody was raised from. So now, just to recap that, so the solution then is, one, you make sure that the antibody, okay, you use the correct concentration, you optimize and validate and verify the required concentration that can be used to be able to bind that very primary antibody, of course, that can be able to enhance the reaction between the primary antibody and the antigen if present. Okay, and also it's also important that we make sure that the secondary antibody is raised from the same animal that the primary antibody is raised from. Does that make sense? Okay, so these are how inadequate secondary antibody or poor secondary antibody selection may affect poor IHC staining. I hope that makes sense. Okay, all right, thank you very much for listening. Please do let me know what you think about the video, and please can I ask you to comment, like, share, subscribe, and I wish you all the best. I'll come back your way again. Bye bye.